Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Yorkshire and Humber webinar, the latest webinar in our series of webinars that we've organised. And thanks very much for your attendance today. So I'm Rob Bradley. I'm the chair of the Yorkshire and Humber branch. I'm delighted to welcome to this afternoon Dr. Sean Lundy from Tetra, who's going to be talking to us about the regulations and the new building regulations that's coming in, well, that's coming now. And we were just talking earlier, it's probably one of the most significant changes of safety legislation over recent years. So there's going to be quite a lot for Sean to go through. So and at the end of it, there'll be an opportunity, of course, to ask questions. So if you just put those into the chat box, and then we'll get through as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the session. So without further ado, Dr. Sean Lundy, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rob. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a few slides, so I'll just do that now. So hopefully that will come up and everyone can see the slides. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all extraordinarily well. I'm Sean Lundy. I work for a company called Tetra. We're a fairly sizable consultancy, about 150 people in our firm. I'm a sort of health and safety professional, like yourselves. And we've been working within this new building safety regime for quite some time now. And I have a couple of other sort of jobs on the side. I work with the Property Institute, which are a new organisation formed out of ARMA, which is the Association of Residential Managing Agents, and IRPM, who are the Institute of Residential Property Managers, professional body and a trade association, have come together to create a Property Institute. And I've been working with them alongside DLUC and the new Building Safety Regulator, consulting on a number of the changes that we're seeing come to fruition now, which I'm going to talk about. And one of my other roles is I work as a visiting academic at University of Greenwich. I used to be the head of a faculty department there, built environment, where we delivered sort of degree programs in all different subjects around built environment, surveying, project management, and indeed health and safety as well. So I still do a bit of that. So in terms of what we're going to do today, I'll just get my slides to move on. There we go. I've got a bit of an agenda, so just a bit of introduction and background around building safety reform, just so we kind of know where we're at. But some of the overview around those key policy drivers as well. You know, why we've ended up where we are. Just talk a bit about the fire and building safety reform legislation that's come in. We'll focus a bit on competence, because I think this is a big feature for the health and safety profession. What does this mean in terms of our own competence? And then a few of the kind of associated things, terms you may have heard. Building safety director is a title that's actually been written into the legislation, which we probably need to talk about, sort of dispel some of the myths there. A bit about the new building safety regulator. The health and safety executive, of course, is forming the new building safety regulator, and that's going to become active this year and into next. And then a little bit about sort of buildings and this concept of special measures. You know, what if a building is not being managed well and the regulator decides to put it into special measures? What does that mean? And then a few concluding thoughts for me, really, about what this all means for all of us. So hopefully we'll get through these, reasonably quickly over the next sort of 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for some questions at the end. I'm sure there'll be a number of questions, so I'm very happy to answer any questions you have. And as Rob said, put them in the chat as well as we're going through. So just in terms of how we've sort of ended up where we are, of course, you know, we're 6 years on from the Grenfell Tower disaster, which resulted in a loss of life of 72 lives and hundreds of homes as well in the Grenfell Tower. We know the tower had recently undergone a revamp, refurbishment, new cladding systems, and we've learned since, of course, that the material used in the cladding, the combustible material there, led to that sort of widespread fire around the building and through the building, and those awful pictures and loss of life that we saw in the media. So those catastrophic consequences have led to a real rethink about the quality of buildings, the types of material that are used on buildings, particularly on the external wall, and indeed have made us question the whole building regulation regime, really, to say, well, look, we've got loads of buildings actually that have been signed off by building control, but actually when we look at them in hindsight, during occupation, we're finding loads of building defects and loads of problems. The Hackett report, so Dame Judith Hackett, who formerly headed up the HSE, I had the privilege of sitting on a committee with Dame Judith. She chaired the myth-busting panel that I was part of for 8 years. So Dame Judith was brought in to do a complete review of the whole regime, and she published a report, Building a Safer Future, which made a number of recommendations, which has led specifically to the new legislation, which we're going to talk about. And then we've had a number of inquiries as well. We've had a Grenfell inquiry, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 inquiry concluded with the government accepting pretty much all of the recommendations and committing to putting them into legislation, which it has largely done. And now we're seeing obviously new legislation come in and the appointment of that new building safety regulator to help improve standards in buildings generally, with a focus, of course, on those residential buildings, which are seen to be higher risk. And I'll talk about high risk buildings, what that actually means. And I'll also talk a little bit about the ripple effect as well. What does this mean for all aspects of health and safety, construction of any building type, and what we might sort of start to see in the future in a way that Dame Judith was very keen to raise the bar, I think, on standards and acceptance that maybe things weren't quite as they should be. And we're going to see that sort of raising the bar, I think, across all areas of building safety and indeed generally health and safety as well. It just a reminder as well, it wasn't the first example of a fire spread that caused concern. Lakanal House back in 2009, which sadly resulted in the loss of 6 people, with at least 20 people injured. A faulty television set, caught fire, and then that fire, instead of being contained to the flat, which is what we want it to do, it spread to a number of other flats as well. And there was concern raised around some of the principles that we apply in residential buildings, like the principle of stay put, where people are asked to stay in their flat if they're unaffected by a fire, but there's a fire in another part of the building. Stay where you are, don't immediately evacuate. And of course, we design the detection and alarm systems accordingly, so we don't have alarm systems which encourage simultaneous evacuation in purpose-built blocks of flats. We tend to operate this stay put policy. So even following Lakanal House, which was some time before Grenfell, there was some concern about that policy and whether that was the correct one. And again, it obviously raised its head again at Grenfell. Lots of questions being asked about that strategy and whether that was the right thing, which has still been debated to some extent today. However, we seem to have settled back on the fact that we should be building residential buildings that are well compartmented and fires are contained to the flat of origin. And in fact, the statistics tend to bear this out. So if you look at the fire statistics, you'll see that less than 10% of fires do indeed spread beyond the flat or room of origin, certainly in higher rise blocks. But it is all dependent on good compartmentation. So obviously post Grenfell, any fire in a residential block will have hit headlines. Journalists aren't going to report on fires where nothing dramatic happens, but we know that the majority of the time a fire that starts in a flat will be contained to the flat and will be extinguished, and no one else in the block will be affected. So that happens most of the time. Of course, we have some examples of where fires are spread in a very unpredictable way, and it kind of points to concern about the way we've designed and built some of our residential properties. So the Barking fire in 2019 was a balcony fire. Every year, especially this time of year, we get a number of fires on balconies where residents have decided to have a barbecue, and the barbecue either sets fire to something on the balcony, or indeed they leave the barbecue unattended, and hot coals end up on a wooden balcony and then set fire to it. So lots of questions around that. You can see in the Barking fire there, it spread rapidly up the outside of the blocks, not what we want to see or would expect. And it's raised lots of questions about whether we should have wooden balconies, of course, on flats, and the risks that presents. Worcester Park was another example of where a block of flats, and Worcester Park was actually a timber frame block, but it was operating a stay put policy. It was designed to be a well compartmented block. When a fire started in one of the flats there, it spread rapidly around the block, and thankfully everyone managed to leave. Nobody was killed or injured, as was the case in the Barking fire, I should say. But actually subsequent investigation revealed that Worcester Park property had missing cavity barriers and defects in the compartmentation, which remained hidden because they were defects and things that were missing from the time of the build. So that was a building that had been signed off by building control, occupied, and then fire risk assessments undertaken, but no sort of intrusive investigation into the building to determine whether the compartmentation was sufficient. Bolton Cube fire in 2019, that was a piece of student accommodation. Again, this threw the spotlight on other types of cladding material. This one was high pressure laminate, HPL, very sort of pretty decorative pattern around the block. A student smoking a cigarette dropped a cigarette into out of a window. It set fire to some material that was trapped in a cavity between the cladding and the building. Set it on fire, and as you can see, it spread very rapidly around the block, and that building had to be evacuated by the fire and rescue service as a matter of urgency. Again, thankfully nobody was seriously injured or killed. And then New Providence Wharf, well, that was a block that was awaiting cladding remediation, so it had Grenfell style cladding on it, and which had to be replaced, but obviously that can't be done straight away, so there was a bit of a delay in getting that cladding sorted out. So in the meantime, they put what we call a waking watch in place, which basically means that there were people 24/7 walking around the building, and if there was a fire, they would then alert people and get them out of the building. Unfortunately, in the New Providence Wharf example, the waking watch didn't function as it should have done, and people were not alerted and didn't know quite what to do. By the time they were told to evacuate, unfortunately, they were walking into smoke-filled corridors because the automatic communal fire doors didn't function either very well. So it was a reminder that, firstly, waking watches don't work very well, and secondly, that you've got to make sure you maintain all the other fire measures, and very importantly, the doors, to make sure the compartmentation is maintained. And then Whitechapel in 2022 was one that kind of threw a spotlight on resident engagement. Residents complained after that fire that they'd raised loads of concerns about the building's fire safety measures, and yet none of them had been documented, or there was no demonstration that they'd been responded to. So the picture that's sort of painted here is a complicated one, but firstly, that there is concern about the quality of our building stock, and the fact that controls like cavity barriers and materials used in buildings is questionable now. So we're seeing a lot more demands for compartmentation, intrusive type surveys when it comes to fire safety. And also we've seen some big changes to building regulations as well to design out these issues in our building stock. just in terms of what we do expect in buildings, there is this kind of design principle. So the first principle, of course, is that there is a high degree of compartmentation. So in other words, if there's a fire in a flat, it will stay in the flat. And that means obviously there's a low probability that fire and smoke will spread beyond that flat of origin. So that's what we expect. But unfortunately, because of the quality of our building stock, we haven't always seen that. So that's where a lot of the attention has been. And also that there's a low risk of fire in common areas due to precautionary management. So, we don't allow residents in residential property to clog up the common areas because, of course, they're means of escape, but also to make sure there's no combustible material stored in those common areas and all the requisite fire doors, to electrical intake cupboards and in communal corridors all work effectively. So that sort of design principle is not changed fundamentally post Grenfell. If anything, it's been sort of reinforced. So what are we beginning to see in terms of changes in regulation? So we've seen a number of bits of legislation come on the books very recently. So we've got the Building Safety Act, which is a big ticket item, and I'll talk a bit about that. We've seen the Fire Safety Act, which has been brought in to amend the existing regulatory reform fire safety order to bring into scope those external walls, balconies, and indeed flat front entrance doors as well. That's a fairly significant change in residential property because legislation has always been very quiet about that. And then we've seen the Fire Safety England regulations come in, and that was to implement those Grenfell inquiry phase 1 recommendations that the government committed to, which I mentioned at the start. And all of this has happened very recently. So the Fire Safety Act came into force last year. The Fire Safety England regs has come in January this year, and we're just seeing the implementation of the Building Safety Act now. But we do expect more secondary legislation and guidance. So as you know, for example, with the Building Safety Act, that's a statute. So we would expect elements of the Building Safety Act to kind of come to life through regulation, and we're seeing some of that regulation come in. And this presents really significant implications for developers, building owners, property managers and residents, and I would say also for the profession at large, because I think it's very important for us as health and safety professionals, whether you are directly involved in building safety, or residential safety matters or not. I think it's really important for you to have an understanding of what these bits of legislation mean. They are absolutely some of the biggest changes we've seen in the health and safety landscape. The Building Safety Act alone is it's 270 odd pages of statute, which if you compare that to the Health and Safety Work Act, which is a lot smaller, you can see how significant that piece of legislation is. So just in terms of what this looks like as a timeline, and I've put links on the slides, and you're very welcome to have a copy of all my slides. Obviously, the Fire Safety Act, as I said, commenced last year, changing the scope of the existing fire safety legislation to bring into scope the external aspects of a building, cladding, balconies, those things that we know now have potential to cause fire spread, but also individual flat entrance doors. Again, a thing that was legislation was very silent on. And if we think back to Grenfell, I mean, we tend to think a lot about the external wall and the awful fire spread across the facade. But actually, there were a number of issues with flat front entrance doors and other communal fire doors as well that simply didn't function. And if you do a bit of if you do a rough thought experiment on that, if those doors, if even sort of maybe 80 to 85% of those doors were fully compliant at the time of the Grenfell fire, in other words, they were suitable and they didn't just swing open because the door closers were missing, or were just simply missing. Some doors were missing from some of those communal corridors. Had they just been 80% in terms of compliance, then that might have saved another 20 people at Grenfell. So fire doors are very, very important, and the legislation has really made that point by focusing in on fire doors. And indeed, the Fire Safety England regulations does focus quite strongly on fire doors. That came in January this year, and brings in requirements for buildings of all height. So, you know, whether those buildings are above 18 metres or not, there are requirements there for buildings that are above 11 metres, above 18 metres, and indeed some requirements that are relevant for all residential blocks, regardless of height. And then we've got the Building Safety Act, which has had a phased introduction, and aspects of the Building Safety Act cover off some weird and wonderful things to do with leaseholder protection. In other words, making sure the developer is held accountable for building defects, rather like that Worcester Park example. And those leaseholder protections have been brought in for buildings over 11 metres. And then this year, we've seen the start of the in occupation phase, if you like, where buildings that are in scope, those over 18 metres or 7 stories, have to be registered between now, between April and October this year. And then the Building Safety Regulator becoming that new building control authority to try and strengthen building control for those high risk buildings. And then next year, feels like next week, next year, April 2024, the Building Safety Regulator will begin to call forward safety case reports, which of course is a new thing that we've never seen before, call them forward for assessment prior to issuing building assessment certificates. So this whole concept of safety case probably needs to be thought through. So I'm not going to go through these slides in too much detail, I'm just mindful of the time. But the Fire Safety England regulations, as I've said, has been brought in to implement those Grenfell inquiry phase 1 recommendations, to make it very clear that fire safety instructions, for example, needs to be provided to all residents. You know, in other words, what do you do once there's been a fire, based on the strategy of the building, but also providing information on the importance of that flat front entrance door and resident responsibilities for those doors. So this is about putting a bit of responsibility back onto the residents as well, to make sure they don't interfere with those doors and they report any defects, but also reminding them that flat front entrance doors, for example, are really important pieces of fire engineering equipment, and they're there to sort of save lives. As I mentioned, for those buildings over 11 metres in height, they've made very prescriptive requirements to do annual door checks for those flat front entrance doors, and then quarterly checks for all fire doors in the common parts. So, and a number of areas there, pretty obvious things that you should be looking for, making sure door closers work, making sure that there are intrumescent seals in the doors, that the hinges are fitted correctly, no visible damage, that type of thing. And just making the point that, of course, in residential buildings below 11 metres in height, there is still a duty in place to implement general fire precautions, which could include maintaining doors, including flat front entrance doors or communal doors. So although in those buildings below 11 metres, you don't have to do those quarterly checks or annual checks and record them, it's still implied that you would need to make sure that they're in good condition. So in other words, they still need to be looked at, either via the fire risk assessment or as a separate inspection activity. And then some very exacting measures for buildings over 18 metres. I'll probably skip through some of these because I think this in itself could be a whole webinar on its own. But they're requiring key things like building plans, details of external wall systems to be provided to the fire and rescue service, monthly checks of other key firefighting equipment, and then reporting any defects that can't be rectified within 24 hours. An explicit requirement here to put what we call secure information boxes, or premises information boxes as they're sometimes referred to, on the outside of those buildings, which will contain details of responsible person and hard copies of floor plans, and also wayfinding signage to be installed in the stairwells. Again, this is another Grenfell, very clear Grenfell reference. So again, I mentioned about the importance of the doors and how, had more of those doors been in a serviceable condition, that could have resulted in saving quite a number of lives. Well, the same could be said for wayfinding signage. when the firefighters had to enter the Grenfell Tower, and maybe they were going up to the 5th floor to rescue someone or to give someone assistance in leaving the block, they had no way of knowing what floor they were on, because at Grenfell there was no wayfinding signage to tell them. So you can imagine if you're in a high pressure situation, stairwells, smoke, the lights aren't working very well. You don't know what floor you're on, you don't know what flats are on that floor. Wayfinding signage is designed to resolve that by making sure that it's there, it's visible in low light or smoky conditions, and you can see what flats and floor that particular floor relates to. So wayfinding signage, had that been in place, probably would have saved a number of lives as well. So just looking at the Building Safety Act in itself, as I said before, it's a huge piece of legislation. Again, I'm not going to be able to cover 270 odd pages in this webinar, so I'm really just going to give it an overview and just focus on some of the important bits. So there are two parts to it really, which I suppose are very relevant to us. The part 3, which it covers the Building Act, which of course is where building regulations sit, and this is the kind of preoccupation. So this is all the planning and construction of new buildings, new residential buildings, and making sure that they are obviously designed, built, and then put into occupation to the right standard. And then part 4 is the higher risk buildings in occupation. So this is the sort of in occupation phase. So the changes to part 3, the things that are changed there is this bringing in of these sort of gateways, and in some cases hard stops. So a building can't move from one stage to the other without satisfying very stringent requirements. So the planning stage, it could be to do with making sure the right permission is gained at that sort of planning stage at Gateway 1. And then you've got the Gateway 2, initial sort of building control, and that provides a hard stop where construction can't stop until the regulator is absolutely satisfied that the duty holder's design meets safety requirements. And then you've got the construction phase through to completion, which is Gateway 3. And in this phase, we're talking a lot about the golden thread of information to make sure that the evidence base, if you like, to show that the building has been designed and built to the correct standard is very clear, and that's handed over to an accountable person. The duty holder will manage that building when it's in occupation. So it's just a much more stringent regime. It does mirror some of the things already in existence. So you know that under construction design and management regulations, there is a requirement to hand over a health and safety file. But often that information, there's a lot of deviation sometimes from that information. And as we've seen from some of those fire examples, Worcester Park, defective cavity barriers, that would have been signed off by building control, maybe a health and safety file handed over. But the reality was the evidence that those cavity barriers had been installed correctly was probably quite weak. So the strengthening of the golden thread of information to make sure that evidence base is stronger and that sign off is better is really a key focus of this new legislation. There's a couple of implications around CDM as well. So we're seeing the expansion of the principal designer role under CDM to include oversight of safety, not just high risk buildings, but all building projects. So it's worth remembering that although the Building Safety Act seems to be very focused, of course, on residential buildings in scope, those higher risk buildings, there is implications here for all building, really, all building projects and how building control function within that. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. And as well as construction site safety duties, principal designers will now have to plan, manage and monitor design work to ensure compliance with building regulations. So for a principal designer, that's a change really, that requires more competence around building regulations, which some principal designers won't have. And then obviously maintaining that golden thread of information, the data on design decisions for fire and structural safety, that's going to be very important as well. So making sure that evidence base is absolutely spot on is required now, actually, and will continue to be so in the future. And then there's a couple of new competence documents which have been very recently produced, PAS 8671 and 8672, which are specifically focused around the competence of individual principal designers, and obviously the competence around individual principal contractors as well. So these two documents are going to be, and will be increasingly more important as we go through to the future, and we see the Building Safety Act sort of unfold, and especially with the new Building Safety Regulator, who's going to have a really keen focus on competence, I think, within the industry to make sure these standards are maintained. So those documents are going to be very important. If you can download a free copy actually from BSI to have a look at that. Just looking at the actual part 4, so part 4 is the in-occupation phase. So here we've got a couple of new duty holders as well. We've got accountable persons and principal accountable persons. So these are new duty holders. So basically, these are usually the building owners or owners of parts of the building. So you can have more than one accountable person. The principal accountable person is typically the building owner or entity that has a repairing obligation for the external aspects of the building. So you could have multiple accountable persons, but you only have one principal accountable person. And it's the principal accountable person that has the duty to register a building in scope, to produce a safety case report. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. To apply for a building assessment certificate when requested to by the regulator, and then comply with mandatory occurrence reporting requirements and produce a resident engagement strategy. So all of these duties only exist for, of course, those buildings with 2 or more sets of domestic premises, which are 18 metres or 7 stories in height. So it's very much focused around that. So this is much more onerous than it's ever been seen before. And because I sort of work in this area, it's really interesting to see how property managers, managing agents, and the building owners are struggling to get to grips with all of this in preparation. So it's a huge challenge, I think, for the property management industry per se, but also for any professionals, any health and safety or fire professionals working in this area, just to make sure you're given the right advice and the right information, because at the end of the day, it's all brand new. So it's quite a big challenge for everyone. Again, there's another, I mentioned competency for part 3. There is also a competency document, a specification for part 4, which is 8673. And again, rather like those other 2 PAS documents, this is going to become increasingly more important as time goes on. So this is really about competence requirements for managing safety during that occupation phase for residential buildings and other developments incorporating residential accommodation. So it could be student accommodation as well. And these competence requirements are not just aimed, of course, at health and safety professionals or fire professionals, but also across anyone that's involved in these residential buildings. So that could be contractors, that could be building owners, could be property managers, and so on. So again, really significant shift in the industry to see this specification land. And of course, what we probably see emerging out of this are various types of training, maybe upskilling of any risk or safety professionals working in these areas as well, perhaps through enhancements to existing qualifications. So just sort of going back to where we are with the Building Safety Act. So the registration portal for duty holders to register the buildings opened in April and will stay open to October. So there's a requirement to register buildings. There's also a requirement to start gathering building information, safety information on the building, which could include basic building information, construction information, things like resident profile, which is a new and challenging area, I think, for a lot of for those that manage residential buildings. details of refurbishment, of course, very exacting details around fire prevention and protection measures, and indeed structural safety as well. So we haven't really had a culture of doing regular structural safety surveys on buildings, and in particular residential buildings, but that is a key requirement now under the Building Safety Act. And having good understanding of services and utilities running into buildings, and also policies around what the maintenance inspection regimes should be as well. So all of this information will be required. Some of it will be required. They call it key building information at registration, but certainly the more detailed information will be required for the safety case report. So just talking about safety case reports, so this rather sort of busy diagram here is really sort of conceptually trying to sort of show what a safety case is and what a safety case report is. So, and actually, this is all based on that golden thread of information. And we are expecting new legislation to land probably this month to detail what should be in a safety case report. So if anyone works in sort of other higher risk safety environments, you might be familiar with safety case report or safety case. Safety case is generally the sort of claim, argument, and evidence presented for a system, a location, or an activity to show that it's safe. So in the same way, the recommendation from Dame Judith was we should use the same philosophy in higher risk buildings, in which case, the duty holder will be required to produce a safety case report, which will explain why their building is safe for occupancy. And that safety case report will have to be supported by a whole range of evidence. So all these bits fanning around the outside are all the types of evidence that may go into that. So that could be the fire risk assessment, it could be door surveys, it could be procedural documents, fire strategies, management plans, it could be structural surveys and so on. So there could be a whole range of information that goes into the safety case report, all of which would need to be supported by some sort of risk management system or a safety management system, probably one of those plan, do, check, act type systems. And indeed, all the evidence would need to be held electronically. So software is going to be a really important thing here. It's going to play a very significant role in managing all of that information. So the regulator's already said that software needs to make sure that this is a single source of truth, that it is stored electronically, and it's secure basically in that software system. So software is going to be really important. One of the other aspects to this is about residents, putting residents at the heart of this new regulatory system. We tend to forget actually our stakeholders sometimes in health and safety, and that's certainly been the case in any previous regulatory framework. We really haven't talked enough about residents in particular, but if you think about this extending into other environments, commercial environments as well, everyone has a role to play in safety, and I think they need to be reminded of that. And residents are no different. So reminding residents of their obligations around not creating fire risk, maintaining their doors, not cluttering up communal corridors, good communication, and obviously using things like smoke detectors, especially in residential property, because we know how valuable they are. Putting residents there, but also putting obligations on residents as well. So part of the change in the regulatory regime is to make that clear as well. So, residents have always had an implied legal obligation not to affect the safety of others in residential blocks, but the Fire Safety England regulations and indeed the Building Safety Act make these obligations more explicit. So the Fire Safety England regs around doors and the Building Safety Act around general safety issues in those buildings in scope, those over 18 metres or 7 stories. So that's a really important shift, I think, in legislation. And indeed, the whole point around resident engagement strategy is to make it very clear that this process is two-way. So the strategy needs to talk about, providing information to residents, but also thinking about what residents will be consulted on, how do we get their views and put them into practice, and then measuring that strategy as well to make sure it's effective. So there's been lots of complaints in this whole sector around with residents not feeling that they're consulted or part of the decision-making process. So this whole requirement for resident engagement strategy will change that. And indeed, we're expecting regulation to support this as well. So there'll be new regulation to support resident engagement strategy as part of that requirement under the Building Safety Act. So I wanted to talk a bit about the Building Safety Director as well. This is a phrase, a title that's been thrown around. It was actually written into the Building Safety Act for a very particular purpose, and that was to support resident management companies and right to manage companies. And basically, there was a big fear that bringing in this new harsher regime would put a lot of directors. Remember, these residential management company directors are what we call, they're lay people. They're not professional property people. They're individuals who live in a block who volunteer to be part of that company and to make decisions, if you like, about things that need to be done. Whereas now, under this section, so 112 and 161, they can appoint a professional building safety director and pay them, and that will relieve all of those unpaid officers of the company of their personal criminal liabilities for any offence committed under that part of the Building Safety Act. So this is quite a big deal. However, it hasn't been supported by regulation yet. So we haven't seen this come to life as such, but there is potential in the future that this will be supported by regulation, and these RMCs and RTM organisations will begin to look for building safety directors to appoint them in these roles. So there's a few questions around that. Obviously, competence is a big one. So who is competent to do this? And also whether there's any professional indemnity cover to cover it off. So as I said there, regulation supporting this has not been released. That was of the 23rd of June, so we're a bit further on from that, but we still haven't seen the regulation. So, but it's one of those sort of interesting things that we've created a whole role here off the back of the Building Safety Act, which has the potential to create a big industry of people sort of perhaps running around consulting as building safety directors in these appointments. And then just a couple of sort of final slides, really. I'm just conscious of time. So I want to sort of wrap it up in the next sort of 3 or 4 minutes. The new Building Safety Regulator, as I said, is emerging out of the Health and Safety Executive. They are there to sort of oversee the safety standards of all buildings. Remember that. So we focus a lot on residential buildings over 18 metres, but the new Building Safety Regulator has made it clear that they are there to oversee the safety and standards of all buildings, helping and encouraging the built environment industry and building control professionals to improve their competence. So competence, as I said before, is a really strong focus of the new regulator. And then, of course, they're going to have a lot of work to do over the next few years, leading implementation of this new regulatory framework for high-rise or high-risk buildings. Just in terms of like safety cases, for example, there are about 12,500 buildings in scope. So that will be 12,500 safety case reports that from April 2024 are going to have to be looked at by the Building Safety Regulator. And they reckon that it's probably going to take them 3 or 4 years to get through all of those safety case reports. So, so this is kind of happening and unfolding in slightly slower time, perhaps, than everyone would like. Bearing in mind we're 6 years on from Grenfell already. So it could be 10 years post-Grenfell before this new regime is fully implemented. And just a bit about their enforcement approach as well. The Building Safety Regulator has said that it will work with these new duty holders to resolve any potential non-compliance. So they're trying to take a very pragmatic approach. If matters can't be resolved, then they will take a range of enforcement action as they would with any other health and safety piece of legislation. But it will exercise its powers in line with regulatory best practice, and that'll be very similar to the approach taken probably around the Health and Safety at Work Act. It will be consistent and proportionate. So, of course, the regulator is a national regulator. Of course, one of the big challenges in fire safety is that the fire safety enforcement is done by individual fire and rescue service authorities, and they can sometimes be slightly inconsistent. And they will target enforcement activity at cases where action is needed. So they're really looking at duty holders that simply don't want to play along with this. And those will be the ones that will probably see themselves in the dock first. And obviously working a lot with local authorities and fire and rescue services as well around fire safety and those sort of areas. And then just a very small bit about special measures manager, because this has come up occasionally. I've had a few people ask me about this. So there are these extreme cases where the building safety regulator could apply to a tribunal for special measures and appoint a special measures manager to take over building safety duties from those duty holders that aren't doing what they should be doing. So that will be a big issue, really. So you imagine a building that's in ownership where the duty holder is just not managing that building well. Well, now there's an aspect, a section in the Act called special measures, which allows for that that building to be taken over. Of course, that's almost like the building safety director in reverse. So I'd imagine that might mean that competency within that role will also be similar to the building safety director competency requirements. So competence will be a really key consideration there as well. Okay, so this is my final slide. You'll be pleased to know, so I've been wittering on for quite a long time now. So just a few concluding thoughts about all of this, and I've tried to give you a real helicopter view of what's happening around the Building Safety Act, what it means. Of course, it is really focused on residential buildings per se, but there's a broader aspect to this. It sort of has a ripple effect, if you like, across the whole of the building industry, but also generally around the health and safety industry. So I think regardless of what area you work in, it's important for you to understand what this means. It is very significant. So maintaining a proportionate golden thread of information is going to be key in managing building related risks. And that principle of golden thread, I think, is really key. I mean, I've always said when it comes to risk management, my doctorate's in risk, that if you've got enough good information, you can manage any risk. And the key to that is good information. So I think whatever we do, the golden thread of information is really important. Safety case expertise is going to be required as well, because of course, certainly with residential buildings, you know, and we're quite close to this, you know, we've been doing early adopter work around writing safety case reports. It's brand new, you know, we've never done it before. No one's really ever done it before. So over the last couple of years, we've really been learning our craft around safety cases and how that can work within that residential sector, which is quite different than writing a safety case in a nuclear power plant. Competence, as I've said, there's a number of new PAS documents. There is an 8670 one as well, a sort of a framing document, but these key ones for principal designer, contractors, and indeed anyone managing buildings that are occupied, these need to be considered at every level. And developers, building owners, and managing agents, well, they all need to be what we call intelligent customers when engaging professionals and contractors. Again, very strong focus on competence, and the regulators using that phrase, intelligent customers, a lot, saying, look, if you engage people to do work for you, then you've got to be confident that they are indeed competent to carry out the work that you're engaging them to do. So that whole thing around contractor selection and engaging professionals and knowing that they're competent is going to be really important. And then residents being part of a decision-making process, and also residents having obligations. So stakeholders, you know, making sure this isn't just one way. Everyone has a part to play in making buildings safe, and that includes the residents who live in them. So they need to be informed of those obligations and probably educated as well. So I think information, informing and educating everyone is a really, really important part of this new regime. And that is my last slide. So these are my contact details. If you did want to get in contact with me, you can always email me at Tetra Consulting, Sean.Lundy at Tetra Consulting, or in fact, you can link into me as well. So I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to do that. I will have a look to see if there's any questions that have come up.
I'll just say, just put in there, and Sean, and say thanks ever so much for condensing so much information there into that presentation. That was really, really interesting and useful. One question I've got actually, before I pass to Suzanne, who's lobbing the questions, because I do a lot of work in the hospitality industry, and does none of this applies to? I mean, you know, there's various large hotels that are being built, but has there been anything said about the changes in legislation for those kind of buildings? This is just aimed at residential, right?
Yeah, so the in-occupation requirements are very much aimed at residential, and don't include some of the other areas you might expect, like hospitals and things like that. I mean, obviously student accommodation does come into this, but hotels not. However, the building standard requirements for hotels is being changed. So that bar is definitely being raised. So that the sort of materials, the sort of management of the golden thread of information, the competency expectations on principal designers who will contribute to that process, those things will be changing. So you will see shifts in that. But you're right, you know, the immediate focus is on those buildings with, you know, with two or more sets of domestic premises that meet that height threshold. It's probably worth mentioning as well that you know, certainly in London, we get a lot of buildings that have got a lot of commercial in, and they might have 2 or 3 residential units in them. So they would be included in this new regime. So even though they're a mixed use building, if they've got more than 2 residential units in them and they meet the height threshold, then they will be, you know, there will be a requirement there for all of those duty holders to cooperate and coordinate in that building around Part 4 of the Building Safety Act.
Yeah, that's interesting, because obviously a lot of buildings nowadays are mixed use, retail, residential, some, you know, hotels as well combined. So in those kind of situations, that's the threshold is 2 residential units. So if there were in a building where there is, I say mixed use as retail as well, would the requirements apply to those retail operators as well?
Well, what they'd have to do, I mean, what they'd have to do is they'd have to sort of share information. I think that would be the key thing. So as an accountable person within that sort of retail area, they would have to cooperate with the principal accountable person in making sure that they have all the right information to manage the building safety risk per se. And also that would have to be acknowledged in the safety case report. So for example, we're doing a bit of work now where we're writing a safety case report for a mixed use building, and we're asking for more information from the other bits of the building, if you like. You know, some of them are commercial offices and there's a bit of residential as well, and that's proving to be quite a big challenge just to get that information back, because they're just completely unaware of what any of these requirements and what they should be doing. So yeah, so there will be that sort of requirement to participate in the process if asked to do so.
Yeah, interesting. That's great. Suzanne, can I ask you if you wouldn't mind doing the questions? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. So there's one question that's come through. How do you feel about progress that has been made as a result of the new fire and building safety regulations? Is this moving as quickly as would be hoped?
No, I mean, I'm deeply frustrated by it, actually, if I'm honest. I think I'm amongst friends here. So, you know, there's a phrase that's used sometimes, you know, a camel is a horse designed by committee. So sometimes, you know, it's really important to have good consultation, I think, when you're creating new legislation, and you've got to get the right people's views on board. But I have never seen so much consultation in all my life. It's been phenomenal. You know, the amount of the amount of consultations that I've had to feed into. I've never done anything like it. So I think it's really good. I think we've landed in a pretty good place. I've always been a bit worried about the proportionality of stuff, that we might be over engineering a little bit of this. But I suppose the biggest frustration is the time it's taken to get here. For me, it's just taken far too long. I was quite happy when we moved quickly on changes to building regulations, and we got rid of combustible material, and we've improved the standard of new buildings. But you've got to remember, of course, that there are an awful lot of buildings in existence or that are occupied now, which are way below the standards of new buildings coming into use. So, new residential buildings now, they have fire suppression systems. They're designed without any of the combustible material that we would see in existing buildings, and they're generally being put into use in a much better state than some of our existing stock. So I think we should have maybe worked harder to bring some of that legislation forward quicker, and maybe there was just too much consultation. You have to remember, though, of course, there's a lot been going on, isn't there? We've had COVID. We've got an economic crisis in some way driven by a war, which none of which is our making. So I guess it would have probably happened a bit quicker had we not had some of those other challenges. I guess that's the way. So I think that's my honest answer to that.
Thank you so much, Sean. There's another question as well. So how are people upskilling to meet these demands, and what are the education providers doing about this?
So I think this is a big deal. I mean, I still have an involvement in the university sector, so I still do a bit of external examining at different institutions, and I think there more needs to be done. I think that I'd like to see either specific content on syllabus content around Building Safety Act and some of the new fire safety legislation for health and safety professionals, maybe additional CPD, but also I think there's a broader thing here, because I run a couple of modules at Greenwich in risk management and safety and risk management, and I think we've learned a lot of lessons here about evidence-based practice. The whole principle around safety case is that you make a claim for safety. The external fabric of my building won't allow for the spread of fire. The argument being that there's no combustible material on it, and then the evidence is, here I've done a survey and I've had an expert look at it. That evidence-based approach needs to be really strongly underlined, I think, in every aspect of health and safety, and I think we could learn that lesson and maybe just emphasize that in other aspects of what we teach when it comes to the qualification framework. So I'd like to see that move on a bit, really. At the moment, there are a few dedicated qualifications emerging, but I think, again, they've been a bit slow to come to fruition.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I don't think there's any more questions.
That's great. Well, I'm happy to share the slides. Well, I did
Yeah,
notice, I noticed a very minor typo on one of my slides. I will correct that. It's very minor though.
I like a pedant. That's good stuff.
I'm just being honest, yeah.
That's brilliant. So once again, thanks ever so much, Sean, for giving up your valuable time to share with us all. And I'm sure we've all found it very, very useful. And Suzanne, if you can do the usual then, if you wouldn't mind sort of circulating those slides afterwards, that would be great. Appreciate that. So thanks ever so much again, Sean.
No, thanks,
enjoy
Rob.
the rest
thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your day. There's a few thank yous coming through on the chat as well. So yeah, thanks again.
That's great. No, please feel free to get in touch, anyone. That's great. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Suzanne. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Bye.